It's day one of a new post-patch metagame. Let's take a look at some decks to play in this exciting new situation. Because of the nature of the patch really only messing with move bounce, there are large effects of this and there are small effects of this. One of the larger effects that I've noticed is a lot of people don't seem to be noticing a massive difference in how the games are actually playing out and what decks are actually going to be elite. I think that that's the kind of thing that takes time to figure out, as decks that were previously held down by move bounce are now more able to thrive and exist in this current metagame. Also, since this is a day one decks list, we're talking very specifically about stuff people have been succeeding with, which means several of these archetypes are going to be well-worn archetypes that you expect, and several of the decks that we talk about are just going to be decks that my friends are succeeding with in High Infinite. Hopefully this provides a good mix at established archetypes and also at weirder off-meta brews that you might be able to find success with. I'm hoping that this kind of content will be helpful to players who are both looking for a great head start in the new metagame and also just a place to explore. So we're going to start with the EK Madi build of Doom 2099 with a focus on the Storm combo. This is a deck that very clearly had some issues with move bounce. If you're playing a Storm deck and you're not fully comboing them out, this card Storm is basically pretty useless against the deck that has Madam Web and a bunch of other cards that can move. Because of a relative decrease in the amount of not just move bounce, but also Heimdall move, this deck now has fewer bad matchups. And that means that you're going to be able to see a lot more baseline power with a deck like this. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it is a collection of good cards that has powerful nut draws attached to it. Don't get too married to the Storm combo version of this. This is just a good deck in the context of your Storm lanes are good. You are good at being a Storm deck with or without the combo that you have access to. This is a deck that can very easily win a Storm lane and then infinite another lane. This is a deck that can have a lot of power on the board and also allow itself to have a wide spread of that power. Not having to deal with very specifically a move bounce deck that can go taller than it and also access Storm lanes is a really big boost for an archetype like this. I would expect to see maybe a little bit more of this deck when it really comes down to it. This is a deck that had a major Predator removed. I think a lot of high elo players picked this deck to be the major beneficiary of the patch. This is, of course, discard, and it is built to be the highest power total in the game. There are a couple different ways to approach this. You can also be playing the Arnim Zola Dakin stuff. This is the deck that a lot of high elo players have picked out as a big winner of this patch because its best competition as a very tall go tall deck, move bounce, was meaningfully hurt by the patch. However, this is a deck that has more available counterplay to it than move bounce. I don't think it's going to be as simple as move bounce gets nerfed and suddenly discard is the go tall deck. I actually think it might be the other way around. Move bounce existing was protecting people from having the ability to tech against discard in a meaningful and powerful way, and now, with a target on its back, this deck might actually slip in performance. It's still going to be one of the best decks in the game, in my opinion. It's going to be a very powerful thing to do with a lot of real applications across being half of a mid-range deck and half of a combo deck. However, I think the reason you're playing this is to be a combo deck, and that can be a little bit awkward if people are actually packing answers for you. This is a powerful deck that does a lot of strong stuff. Being able to duplicate Bullseyes off of Frigga, Morbius is off of Frigga. All of the nut draw stuff that this deck does puts it up there with the best decks in the game, if not above them. The power levels that this deck can access are some of the highest possible point totals that you'll ever see in a game of Marvel Snap that does not involve maybe the card Mr. Negative or maybe the card Living Tribunal. These numbers go crazy, and it's not all that hard to get them. The downside here is your big number games are incredibly dependent on whether or not you're able to get a swarm to zero cost, and having those big numbers is sort of a major part of your game plan. So having a major part of your game plan be like particularly dependent on having cards in a certain order and having that specific thing be unlocked makes it a little bit awkward. Sometimes you'll queue into a matchup that you basically can't lose unless you don't draw Swarm, and then you won't draw Swarm. Like, that kind of stuff is real, and the deck is a little bit of a mopey mid-range deck when it's not super popping off. But, of course, the upside is you get to be a mid-range deck as your floor and then super pop off as your ceiling. Another notable beneficiary, in my opinion, of the changes to move bounce is the Tens deck. The Tens deck has always been good at beating other mid-range decks because it has the ability to deal with basically everything that it can beat with points. Its biggest weaknesses are decks that it basically just cannot beat with points. Move Bounce was a notable one of these, where it's just like, okay, I don't really have the ability to beat you if you have a giant Human Torch in one lane, then you copy that giant Human Torch, put it in another lane, I guess I just get got. And now, Aranya got nerfed, that giant Human Torch is a little bit smaller, Dagger got nerfed, you're no longer going to have to deal with 24 power daggers running around. Suddenly, this deck is actually able to, in a meaningful way, contest those lanes more than it was previously able to. When you chop the top off of a deck like Move Bounce, especially in the context of an OTA on day one, a lot of people are just going to stop playing it, which is great for this deck. Because this deck is very good at beating stuff that can lose to 30 power in a lane, but not necessarily so good at beating stuff that can get higher than that. And that exact inflection point is what was attacked in the Move Bounce deck. And I think that also sort of lowered the inflection point of like the entire metagame in this context, where it's like, there's just a little bit less, either because Move Bounce got hit or because people are playing it less, of decks that are really able to go over the top of the Surtur deck right now. This is a really interesting contextual shift that I do think is due to the Move Bounce changes, where you have this deck that was previously like, you can't really rely on it because there are multiple decks that go over the top of it. Now there's only maybe one, and people are definitely not playing the other, and people are exploring more mid-rangey decks as a natural cause of this, and so this deck has a lot more natural prey as opposed to natural predators. For the first time in a while, I got a Big Baby deck for you. Big Baby, longtime friend of the channel. Big Moon Girl truther has been for a while. A lot of the advances in Moon Girl stuff have been due to him and Yo Woody and a couple of other people. And I think that this is a very reasonable deck to play in the context of what things are looking like right now. What I really like about these kind of Moon Girl decks, though, is that they don't have to be Moon Girl decks. They're able to just meaningfully put points on the board in normal games. I think this is a fun little addition to the Moon Girl archetype, the Miles Morales package, because now we have multiple cards that are actually reasonably good to clone and also can move. So the ability to like move a Jeff, make your Miles cost 1, move a Rocket and Groot, make your Miles cost 1, all that stuff is cool, but you also just have a reasonable mid-range game plan here. You are still a mid-range deck that runs a card like Red Guardian that can interact in meaningful ways. You have reasonable power in unexpected ways, and you have your Moon Girl Nut Draw. This is another deck that I think benefits pretty heavily from the nerf to Move Bounce. I think one of the things that you're going to see in a world where people are playing less Move Bounce, which is definitely the world we're living in right now, whether or not that should be true is still remains to be seen, but we're definitely living in a world where people are playing less of the deck, which means there's room for, I guess, what you'd call lower ceiling combo decks to emerge, and I think you could describe the Surtur deck like that, and I think you could describe this deck like that. I don't think Arishem has ever been actually bad. I think it's just always been a pretty good deck, but one of the really smart things to do in a world where a new metagame is evolving and we haven't really figured out what exactly the best thing to do is just take a fundamental advantage and be like, I'm going to leverage this fundamental advantage. Arishem has an energy advantage. It gets to play Doom 2999 early. It gets to play Galacta early. It gets to do all this stuff early. And so you get to leverage a base level advantage. This is also beneficial because it typically takes a synergy deck that can go over the top of Arishem a little bit more time to figure out than it does Arishem, because Arishem is just so clearly built at this point. We know what the deck is. We know what the deck is about. I'm still running Ares in mine. It's still very good. It was almost going to be a deck highlight on Arishem today. I decided to do this instead to highlight some of the decks that my friends are playing, but this is absolutely a banger deck. It is absolutely incredible. I still think it is quite good. And I think it is, if I had to guess, probably my best performing deck on the season as a whole, in a metagame that got a little bit more tolerable for it, because the major thing that Arishem doesn't like to see are synergy decks that are able to go over the top of it, like Move Bounce, and it is non-zero more able to beat a deck like Discard, or at least understand that it's dead against a deck like Discard, than it was against Move Bounce. I've seen some discussion of this deck recently in some contexts that I don't really think it actually should be discussed in, so I think it's probably worth talking about what this deck actually is. This is a deck that was made by Butt. Butt is a player who often plays in the top 10, but he is one of the best players in Marvel Snap, very specifically at leveraging information asymmetry. He will have a surprise in his deck for you. In this deck, the surprise is Galactus. Once the surprise is out the window, the deck's win rate drops pretty precipitously because he's no longer getting those free wins off you. He's also a player who's excellent at getting into the heads of his opponents and making reads on what makes sense for them to play on that turn. This makes him better with a deck like this, a Guardians of the Galaxy deck, than basically anyone else ever would be. I've seen people talking about this deck like it's a real contributor to the meta. I want to be clear, I don't think that's what it is. But it does represent ways in which top infinite players can leverage different levels of skills and certain approaches to the game and still see massive success. This is not a great deck, but it can be. And if you're a good enough player, it will be. And that, I think, is worth pointing out. On my last Hot Takes video, someone had a take that I put at the very end that was like, top 50 players never innovate. And I think that's just basically ridiculous because of people like Butt and because of decks like this. Top 50 players are basically constantly innovating because the value of asymmetric information when you're playing the same people is extremely valuable. I still see people who see me play against Butt when he's playing this deck and are like, there's no way he's running Galactus. He is. We know that. And I think that that kind of stuff, the value of asymmetric information, the value of getting in your opponent's head, that stuff is really important in terms of skills to learn. And I think that's worthwhile. One of the things that playing with and against this deck has done for me is made me a little bit better at understanding, all right, what does it make sense for my opponent to play here? If they are looking at this, where is the lane that they are going in? It's made me better at playing Iron Patriot, actually, because I'm able to evaluate things like, oh, they put a Quicksilver here, so I don't think they're going to want to Iron Patriot that lane because that's using 2 slots on 5 power. They're probably going to Iron Patriot a different lane. So if I Iron Patriot that lane, I will then be able to have an advantage in that lane, and I won't be putting myself in an awkward situation in terms of using too many slots in a lane when I go to back up that Iron Patriot. Like, stuff like that is actually something I learned from playing with and against this deck. Being able to get into my opponent's mindset, understanding how they think and what they're thinking about, and the processes by which they approach the game. There's valuable stuff here. All right, now that we've all gotten over our brief insanity where everyone was putting Ares in this deck, we can say this deck is good again. We don't want to make any changes to it in a meaningful way. This is still a good deck at being a mid-range deck. I know there are going to be people in the comments maybe who are like, oh, do you want to put Luna Snow and Lady Deathstrike in here? Because Luna Snow just got buffed, and that's what Fudge has been playing, and it's like a pretty solid deck. I still don't. I think that ultimately the strength of this deck is being the best Iron Patriot deck and beating other mid-range decks. It is there to leverage a cheap death. It is there to leverage Iron Patriot cards. It is also going to some of the time be able to mill your opponent, but that's not really what we're about. What we're about is cheap death, cheap Iron Patriot cards, big numbers on our 3s. That's what we're trying to do here, and that is still a very powerful thing to do. I didn't even mention the Hood Misery stuff. There's a bunch of just strong numbers in a deck like this. This powerful mid-range deck that has a lot of strong things, has some interaction in the deck, and is able to deal with a wide variety of situations. If you're still Hela-ing, I think this is probably the best build of Denish's Hela here. We have, of course, instead of the Supergiant, a Morphin here, which is an adaptation that I actually had on the most recent tier list as well, but Denish himself has actually begun to adopt this too, so I think that's a very solid indicator that it makes a lot of sense. The idea with Hela has always been the same. We are gambling, we are fully committed to the Gamba, and if we end up discarding our Hela to our stuff, it's actually not that bad. We're still going to be able to win lanes with Gore or whatever. We have our Ghost Rider, we have our Odin, we have backup plans, and I think backup plans is sort of the way to describe this because this deck rarely wins with Plan A, but it very often can win with Plan B, Plan C, Plan D. It can sort of improv its way out of bad situations due to the energy it gains from Corvus Glaive, which I actually think is really worth pointing out. Like, Corvus Glaive is just quite strong, even though you're discarding 2 cards, like you might not have been playing them anyway, and you have the ability to turn those discarded cards into an advantage. I almost think this is less of a Hela deck and more of a Corvus Glaive deck in the context of how it actually tends to play out. There is a lot of powerful stuff this deck can do, and I think that it is worth respecting in a world where people are getting a little more mid-rangey. this is the kind of deck where it's like, oh, okay, I actually have nothing for this some of the time. From Fanta, a high infinite player who's kind of a bit of a Thanos one trick at this point. Not necessarily, but I see a lot of Thanos cooking coming out of that person's brain. This is a destroy Thanos deck that is using Luna Snow to accelerate the death and has multiple additional ways of making death incredibly cheap. There's a very limited amount of actual power in the deck in the context of we don't have a lot of big guys, but it does play surprising and it does have real beef to it. I honestly think this feels a little bit more like Mill in terms of how it plays. Like, oh, we're going to get a cheap death. We're going to mid-range them out of here. We're going to play Killmonger. We're going to ramp into stuff. We're going to have some dudes. I think that's, like, it's a legitimately valuable thing to do. It's just sometimes you do get gone over the top of, but this is another deck that lost a deck that would normally go over the top of it in terms of things that it are able to deal with it. And it gained a point of power on Luna Snow, which synergizes very well with Death. I have never had a particularly high opinion of the sort of Killmonger Death Thanos archetypes. The last time I think one was good was when Wave was a completely different card that allowed you to play a Death and something else, basically. It's been a while, but I do think that this is a very reasonable attempt at making Thanos decent again, and I think I want to reward people who are trying to make Thanos decent again. This deck has some interesting stuff going on, and I like what it's doing. I like how it's put together. I don't know if it has the power level to hold up to everything, but I do like it. I find it hard to believe that this deck is actually bad at this point. This deck just has too much power in it, and I don't think enough people are playing it, and it has a bunch of numbers, and it has a bunch of interaction, and I kind of think that in a world where move bounce has gone away, this deck is going to have a reason to have more meta share, where I think this deck has a real reason to exist right now, because it's like a fairly aggressively positioned deck, but it plays the tech cards for a wide variety of matchups. You have stuff to deal with big guys like US Agent, you have your Cassandra Nova for Arishem, you have a ton of stats, and you're no longer getting outstatted by move bounce because people aren't really playing that right now, whether or not they should. And I think that that means that this deck might actually exist in the space that old normal bounce does. I think it pretty clearly does exist in that space to me, where this is the equivalent of old normal bounce, but the reason you're playing it instead of old normal bounce is so you have access to Cosmo and you have access to Red Guardian. And I think that that is a really valuable spot to put yourself in, actually, being the, like, sort of fusion of bounce and a deck that can actually interact with people. I think that's a nice spot to be in. It's a good thing to be doing, and you get a lot out of doing it. I would not be surprised if this deck had a bit of a sleeper presence in this metagame. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching this video. As always, remember, this is just day one decks. This is not a full tier list. If you are worried about how expensive stuff on this decks looks, I mean, a lot of it is me focusing on things that are unique and weird and new, and a lot of stuff that happened in the patch involves unique and weird and new cards, right? Move bounce goes out of the way, suddenly we're focusing a little bit more on, like, Havoc decks, right? Luna Snow gets buffed. I know a lot of you don't have her. Don't worry, it's gonna be okay. You're not gonna need her, I don't think. I did want to address some of the stuff that I saw in the comments to yesterday's video. A lot of stuff was like, how are you talking for 20 minutes about, you know, something so meaningless, a patch so meaningless as that? And I don't know. I think a lot of it is I don't find it meaningless. Like, I see meaning in a lot of stuff. I don't think it's very hard to find. And I think that it's worth talking about stuff like that because so many people don't seem to see it as something that actually matters, right? Like, what does it mean that move bounce leaves the metagame? What does it allow for? There's like 4 decks on this list that probably wouldn't be on this list if move bounce was still around, because they would have such, not necessarily a prohibitively bad matchup for it, but a bad enough matchup that you'd have to think twice about whether or not this was a really good decision to play, because whenever you ran into it, you just be like sighing and going like, all right, I guess it's happening again. And I guess my thing is, in addition to that, my watch time on that video was up, meaning that people really enjoyed hearing me just yap about whatever, which is weirding me out. Like, I don't really have an explanation for that, but I mean, thank you is really what I'm getting around to, is that, like, while some of the comments were very, you know, keep yapping, jerk face. A lot of the actual metrics that I saw were like, no, we actually want you to keep yapping, not jerk face. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. If you got this far in the video, remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.